Hello and welcome to the Open Mix tutorial on the Hofa Christmas contest song, Down on Earth It's Christmas Time. With 42 tracks, the number of channels is quite manageable, and with the many real instruments, the song seems almost vintage but in a way that's modern too. In total, I used only 4 different plugins to mix the song, with one of them appearing 36 times. Maybe you guess which one. I hope you've got yourself a drink and a snack, because we're going to walk through all the tracks together and it might take a while. Let's start in a traditional way with the drums, as befits a Christmas carol. The great Tommy Baldo was the perfect drummer for this song. Tommy also influenced the overall sound strongly with the percussion tracks such as the udu, shaker and cymbal swells. The drum set he used was built in the 1940s. At that time, even the tension brackets were made of wood, as metal was needed for the military. This did not harm the sound of the set. The 2 overhead tracks were panned 100% left and right and routed into an overhead group. There, the system master limiter, in the transient reducing smooth mode, pushes the drums back so that hi-hat and cymbals move forward. In order to intensify this focus on the cymbals, the EQ cuts the bass and mid frequencies. At 3 and 6 kHz, this is done dynamically in order to keep control of the occasional loud crash without taking away the brilliance of less intense sounds. In my opinion, the side stick was a bit too loud on the overheads. Automation does the trick. The room mics were placed several meters away from the drum set for the recording. Therefore, it is especially important to minimize the transients on these tracks. At the same time, the low and high end are usually out of place in room or ambience tracks. The System Comp Listen mic solves all these problems at once. That's why it's so impressive when it's about gluing together highly dynamic tracks like drums. Have a listen. And this is how it sounds without. Now again with the plugin. The subsequent EQ then only needs to soften the high mid-range. Reducing the stereo width moves this ambience track even further to the rear of the mix, and that's where it belongs. When there's an especially powerful snare and with every hit of a tom, the automation boosts the volume of the room far track by up to 10 dB for more impact and depth. The kick drum was mic'd in 3 very different ways. The Neumann U47 FET is a great bass drum mic. It has a nice smooth high end and an excellent low end. Kick front shows a completely different image of the same instrument. And the sub-kick track, recorded with a 10-inch speaker as a mic, is indeed only providing the low frequencies. Having such a palette of timbres at your disposal when mixing is really fantastic. All 3 bass drum sounds are fed into the kick group without any processing. Each of them has its part to play in the overall sound, with the U47 FET being a little louder than the other 2 in my mix. The channel inserts are only used to set the perfect balance. Thanks to the clever recording techniques, the EQ on the group channel doesn't have much to do either. Although Tommy's kick sounds great on its own, I experimented with some samples. when a vintage kick drum from Native Instruments added a very organic layer to the natural bass drum, I couldn't resist. What do you think? I automated the level of the triggered kick sample in order to set specific accents with these defined impulses. There were 3 completely different signals from the snare drum as well. The Punchy Shure SM57, a darker condenser mic, and it's always worthwhile to capture the bottom of the snare as well. Again, all signals are sent into a group without processing, but with different levels. The SSL-style channel compressor enhances the attack of the snare drum, and a very wide peak filter is boosting the presence range. The sound of the snare drum is then augmented with a bright sample for a bit more punch. The side stick does not have a trigger sample. The toms are made a bit brighter, with a wide peak filter at 20 kHz, and then processed with the system master limiter, again in smooth mode, so that the gain reduction is around 10 dB. This makes the toms sound more powerful, as their sustain becomes more audible in the mix. The low tom needs a few volume adjustments via automation. The cymbal overdubs and the UDI drums need substantial volume fades. In fact, I adjusted the level of every beat to see which volume would be best. Especially during a transition or vocal pause, you can push an instrument to the front to fill in the gap. The cymbal overdubs go through a classic flanger. The EQ removes bass and mid-range components, as these frequencies are reserved for other instruments. A tremolo adds some rhythmic motion to these otherwise static cymbal sounds. In the UDIs, the limiter again reduces transients so that they don't clash with the transients of the drums. It is quite unusual that the algoverb is inserted before the limiter. However, this results in more reverb on the louder beats of the instrument than on the softer ones, which I think sounds interesting. We don't need the UDI drums to be as wide in the stereo field as they are recorded. As with the transients, a clear hierarchy is advantageous for the overall sound of the mix. The EQ enhances mid and high frequencies to bring out the details of the performance. For the same reasons as before, the reverb of the shaker is placed before the look-ahead limiter. The 6 dB low cut at 4.5 kHz removes a fair amount of the mid-range and places the shaker in its frequency window. The reverse sample only shows up at the very beginning. It serves as a background for the video opening, creating an impression of a spaceship in outer space. Snare and toms are enriched with the gated perfect effect of the IR verb through this bus. In solo, it sounds like that. All drum and percussion sounds are finally routed into the drum group. The new system master limiter in the transparent mode increases the loudness while protecting the transients even when there is a significant reduction. With this limiting in the group, it is much easier to achieve an appropriate master loudness of the mix. The Ampeg simulation compresses the sound of the bass guitar and generates nice harmonics that help to connect the individual registers of the instrument. The low and high mids could still use a little boost from the EQ, so that the bass can cut through the mix without getting muddy. Depending on what Dennis has played, the boosted high mids are a bit too loud. With the dynamic control of the frequency band, however, this can be easily managed. Due to the low cut in the sidechain, this adaptive compressor is less responsive at low frequencies. This gives the bass a somewhat fuller sound. A 6-voice stereo chorus makes the sound wider and more exciting. Volume fades emphasize the dynamics of the individual parts. For example, the bass is quieter in the verses and 1 or 2 dB louder in the chorus, as well as in important phrases. I had to come up with something special for the Moog Taurus bass. I wanted it to be loud, but at the same time I didn't want it to compete with the bass guitar. The solution was to focus on the mid-range, giving it its place in the mix. The heavily driven system saturator is located in a multi-band module and has its core range at about 1 kHz. That is in the mids as well. Without this mid-band saturation, the Taurus sound would not perform as well as it does. Some flanger, and a slight reduction of the stereo width. The automated volume fader supports the given envelope of the Taurus. The song was written on the dobro. To me, this resonator guitar is supposed to be audible all the time. Since it has a rather unique sound character, I had to work out the perfect sound carefully. The result is a very detailed EQ setting in which 5 of the 9 bands are dynamic so that they only work in louder parts. The soft limiting after the EQ makes it easier to blend the instrument into the playback. A subtle ambience that is tailored to this sound puts the resonator guitar in the right place. The automation of the volume is similar to that of the bass guitar. The volume can be a bit higher in the stronger parts. There is also an automation curve for the panorama. In the louder and fuller parts of the song, the dobro moves out of the center. The same goes for the 12-string guitar, which complements the dobro at some stages of the song on the opposite side of the panorama. The 12-string guitar is EQ'd to work as a kind of stereo extension for the dobro and to stay in a similar frequency range as the resonator guitar. Only one dynamic EQ band is used here, as the instrument sounds quite balanced and is always played with the same intensity. The full-range limiter of the dynamic EQ in look-ahead mode cuts the level peaks. The role of the guitar is underlined by the plate vivid reverb of the system iReverb. It sounds more striking and bigger than the reverb on the dobro. The 12 string is meant to accentuate while creating spatial depth. The Fender Rhodes that was played by Fabian already sounds great as a DI signal. My attempts to reamp the sound brought no improvement. Of course, the vintage keyboard needs a boosted presence range in this arrangement. A little bit compression. Some retro reverb. A proper old-style chorus. The typical tremolo. And some automation that brings out the details. That's it for the Rhodes. The chords and melodies on the lap steel were played over a range of more than 3 octaves. So it is not surprising that several of the EQ bands work dynamically to adapt to the different registers. Since this guitar-like instrument has to cooperate with the vocals too, the sound seems remarkably indirect due to the delay, reverb, and modulation. For the depth of the mix, however, this is an advantage. In this background area there is still enough space for the lap steel. This one also features an artificial, but completely different space. Neither reverb nor delay, just 8 vivid modulations and the full stereo width. The EQ boosts shape the sound, leaving room for the vocals. Speaking of vocals, here are David's lead vocals. The equalizer makes his voice sound fuller and more present. It also removes the resonance at 3.5 kHz, both with dynamic and static EQing. The look-ahead mode of the EQ dynamic ensures that the individual bands and the full-range limiter operate rather unobtrusively. A subsequent adaptive compressor adds some more compression so that the voice is placed up front and there is hardly any need for fader rides. The 8th note delay with phaser is meant to give this lead voice a slightly fancy and spacey touch. Another special feature is this multi-band unit. Below 630 Hz a flanger is added, and above the crossover frequency there is a compressor. That may seem a bit strange, but it's quite useful. This way, the flanger modulates only the mid and low frequencies of the voice, and the compressor is used to subdue the high mid and high frequencies of the voice, making it sound warmer, fuller, and more consistent. Take me home, at every because before the chorus, the flanger is intensified by the automation, making David's phrase more interesting. At the same time, the stereo width is reduced in these spots, so that the chorus that comes directly afterwards seems wider. The lead vocal reverb is my all-time favorite, the large, famous bright plate. It always fits. The IQ Series de-esser takes care of the sometimes harsh and loud sibilance of all vocals in the clever bus mode. Lord, I try. For Kalinda's lead vocals, the processing chain is similar to David's. I have given particular attention to the fader ride in order to present Kalinda in the best possible light, but also to make sure that David is the uncontested lead singer.
On a holy night, oh, won't you come by?
The backing vocals of Ira and Kalinda have a total of 11 tracks and are combined and mainly processed in one group. The chorus is added via automation to varying degrees, depending on the particular part. These two high-frequency bands are boosted by up to 20 dB in the OO parts in the chorus to give the voices a lot of brilliance. In general, the well-considered fader rides are decisive here as well. This also applies to the individual vocal tracks in the group. The reverb on the backing vocals is the same large famous bright plate as on the lead vocals. The only difference is that the pre-delay is now set to 0 milliseconds, which, as you know, places them further back in the mix. That leaves the master bus. If you expect a lot of processing here, you might be disappointed. When I have the chance to master directly in the mix, as in this case, I usually only need a decent mastering limiter. In these dynamic songs, I add an adaptive sum compressor in front of the limiter, which is used to glue the various parts of the song together. Then there's the analyzer. I know that many people think, trust your ears, spectrum analyzers are evil and will pull you to the dark side of the sound. Well, I see that differently. So, we've been through all the tracks, and I hope I could give you some inspiration along the way. Have fun with your productions.